June 6, 1944. Heinrich Severloh sits in a concrete box above Omaha Beach, an MG-42 across his knees, and a letter from Metzingen folded against his heart. He believes, as he has been taught to believe, that the Atlantic Wall is destiny made solid. He believes the invasion will be thrown back into the sea. By nightfall, he will be surrounded by 13,500 empty shell casings, his gun barrel warped by heat, and a new, unbearable knowledge. Courage and skill can be drowned by machines of supply and tide. This is not the familiar story of victory and glory. This is the view from the losing side, the men who watched the world arrive on their doorstep and could not stop it. They trained, they dug, they trusted doctrine. They watched Field Marshal Rommel inspect embrasures and nod approval. They counted mines and stakes and concrete as if numbers could become an argument. Yet, on this morning, the argument fails. A meteorologist in Paris calls the channel impassable. Other weather reports say otherwise. Officers go home, orders scatter. The sea fills with ships until the horizon becomes a grey carpet. Battleships pound with guns that sound like a new geological season. Air power that should have turned the tide barely leaves a shadow on the sand. The defenders feel something worse than fear, a sense of betrayal by the map they were given, a moral confusion that comes when facts outgrow belief. What follows is not only bullets and blood, it is a lesson in scale. Ammunition meant to hold a beach for days vanishes in hours. Armored columns that could have struck in time are kept waiting by hesitation. Hobart's funnies drive ashore like solutions in steel, bridging problems the defenders thought immutable. The Allied machine keeps landing men and materiel hour after hour until replacement becomes a weapon itself. Listen to this story, because it is a study of collapse from the inside. The German soldiers' final report is not just a list of losses. It is a human record of how ideas fail when matched against industrial reality, how duty and conviction can be worn down by numbers. Stay with this account to the end, and watch how a single day on a single coast rewrote the meaning of modern war for the men forced to survive it. June 6, 1944. The date will later be carved into memory as an opening line of history. But for Heinrich Severloh, in the small hours before that dawn, it was only the moment when the world narrowed to a single square of light and a strip of steel. He sits in WN-62, a concrete throat bored into the cliff above Omaha. The bunker smells of rust and old sweat. He wipes the barrel of his MG-42 with a rag until the metal catches the dim lamp and shines like a promise. In his breast pocket, a letter from Metzingen warms his chest, a woman's neat handwriting promising to wait until the war's victorious end. He believes the promise the way soldiers believe their boots and belts, because belief keeps the night from swallowing them. 3 days earlier, a great shadow had walked the line. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel paused at the embrasure, looked through a slit at the channel, and studied the geometry of overlapping fire. He approved. He said words that were meant to steel men. This beach will be their cemetery. For Severloh, Rommel's nod was a benediction. The Atlantic Wall, 2,400 miles of reinforced coast, 58 divisions manning interlocking sectors, millions of tons of concrete and steel, felt eternal. It had been built like a cathedral of deterrence. 17 million cubic meters of concrete poured, 1.2 million tons of steel sunk into Normandy's earth. Stakes and hedgehogs, Belgian gates, telemines, 3,700 obstacles in the tidal zone alone, spoke of a meticulous arithmetic of defense. Behind the high tide, millions of mines hunched like a second army. Rommel had wanted 60 million. Command had allowed only a fraction. The wall was their theology. Heinrich counts the objects that mean safety. The MG-42's bolt, the sandbags stacked in geometric certainty, the radio's predictable static, the map with sectors coded by number. Each thing is a line in a contract with the war. He thinks in lists because lists are how men survive chaos. Clean weapon, loaded belts, watch the surf at low tide, count the mines. He repeats his father's lessons. He repeats his superior's dogma. The Atlantic Wall is destiny made concrete. Outside, the channel is black and unremarkable. The night is calm. The sea's breath is slow enough to lull a man into forgetting the scale of what armies can do. In the dark, even the best plans shrink to small tasks. Oil the hinge, check the plug, rewrap the letters to keep them from damp. Severloh's hands know rituals that steady his mind. He hums a song his girlfriend once liked. He writes a line in the margin of the letter, a private vow of return, and tucks it back into cloth. There is a small human arrogance in the quiet. They believe the wall and the maps will hold because they have been trained to believe. And yet there are fissures beneath the stone. In Paris, a Luftwaffe meteorologist, Walter Stuber, reads wind and cloud and pronounces the English Channel temporarily impassable. His forecast carries authority. It is signed, stamped, and fatal in its consequences. The front line receives that authority and relaxes into a brittle ease. Staff officers take leave, patrols are reduced, and commanders permit small comforts. Rommel departs to Germany to visit his wife on her birthday, carrying a pair of grey suede shoes as if the world were ordinary. General Friedrich Dollmann and others attend war games far from the beaches. The absence of leaders is a small betrayal, the kind that wells up slowly into panic when noise begins. There are other weather reports. Far out over the Atlantic, sensors and secret stations, Allied eyes that Germany's maps do not acknowledge, record a short, sharp opening in the storm. Ships at sea will call it a window of heaven. Officers in London and the staffs of Eisenhower and Group Captain James Stagg name it a chance that will not wait. The difference between the two forecasts is not poetry but reach. One chart reads coastal tendency, the other reads the entire expanse of ocean where storms move like armies. The men in the bunkers do not see those graphs. They only see the calm night, the ticking watch, the warm letter. Severloh thinks of those missing commanders as a flaw in others. He thinks of discipline and duty. He thinks of Rommel's nod, and his hands tighten on the MG. His world is small, but within it there is order. Still, at odd beats in the night, he imagines improbable things. He has heard talk of mock parachute drops, dummies wired with firecrackers meant to confuse. He has been told of deception, Titanic, Rupert, names that sound like theatre. He has been taught to read the world by pattern. Now the patterns grow noisy. A crackle on the radio, a report with mismatched coordinates, a voice that misidentifies the direction of a drop. Each anomaly presses against the tidy lines of doctrine. Psychology works in layers. The first layer is fear, the raw biological tightening that says run or hide. The second is humiliation, the slow realization that what you were taught is incomplete. The third is betrayal, the feeling that the map you were given lied. Severloh feels all three like cold water. He also feels guilt, a private ledger where each small comfort, the letter, the neat weapon, the cigarette stub, is counted against unknown futures. He knows the way soldiers try to preempt fate, by ritual, by repetition, by bolstering small tasks until the big catastrophe can be managed. So he polishes the barrel, counts rounds, imagines the sound of his gun will be an argument that cannot be refuted. The bunker offers both refuge and womb. It amplifies sounds and shrinks horizons. From its slit he can see a sliver of channel, a horizon line with no ships and no light. That lack comforts and terrifies him. The mind fills emptiness with meaning. What if the sea stays empty? What if the forecast is right and no fleet arrives? Then the weeks will stretch, and they will have wasted vigilance. But what if the other forecast is right? What if the thin calm is the breath before a storm? These two small possible worlds make a new small war in his head, between pride in preparedness and the dread of being proven wrong. Severloh remembers the faces of men who promised to defend every span of sand. He remembers Bernhard Fröcking at WN62, speaking in a tremor of disbelief, when he once joked that they were witnessing the whole world arriving at their doorstep. No one laughed at the joke then. It slides towards prophecy now. The wall sculptures of steel and concrete, the millions of mines inland, the Tory of engineering that had been a source of pride, all of it appears to him as an immobile argument against movement. But arguments can be drowned in numbers. He has not yet learned how to count that way. He believes because not believing would be a different death. He stacks belts of ammunition like rosaries, calculates burst lengths for the MG42, short, disciplined bursts to control the weapon's savage rate, and memorizes his arc of fire. Technical detail is a kind of prayer. At 200 rounds per minute, the MG42 can shred waves of bodies if the barrel can bear it, if the belts hold, if the supply arrives. The equations are simple and terrifying. Firepower without logistics collapses. No one in the bunker speaks much of logistics. They speak of courage. They speak of orders. They speak of duty. Night deepens. Somewhere to the west someone laughs. a brittle sound that might be a fox or an officer nervously easing his pipe. The bunker's concrete seems suddenly thinner, as if time were a drill threatening to break through. Severloh opens the letter, reads the last line again. The handwriting is small, firm. Wait for me. He closes his eyes and tries to believe that letters can outlast shells. Outside, beyond sight, data shifts. Men who will never meet Severloh argue with instruments over charts that will decide millions of lives. The small world of WN62 does not include those charts. It includes only a lamp, a gun, a letter, and the knowledge that Rommel once inspected this very machineries and pronounced confidence. The paradox hangs heavy. A field marshal's approval and the meteorologist's forecast are both forms of authority, but they point in different directions. Which authority will matter when the horizon finally answers? Heinrich counts the casings in his mind, imagines them neat in rows, a counter of success. He cannot imagine them scattered and smoking, a testimony not to skill, but to replacement. He has not yet imagined the arithmetic of a nation that can replace men faster than bullets can count them. That is an abstraction beyond the bunker. It will arrive later as a fact that eats at conviction. For now, the night is a thin mirror. He looks into it and sees himself with an MG42, a young man with trained hands and a letter he cannot relinquish. He has not yet felt the full humiliation of being outnumbered, not by courage, but by factories. He has not yet heard the hull of the first ship break the horizon. He has not yet felt the barrel warp from prolonged fire. He has not yet counted 13,500 empty casings and lost the arithmetic of meaning. A far radio emits a distant, clipped sentence, an order, a correction, or merely static. The bunker seems to listen. The world outside breathes a gearing sound, as if a great engine had been turned on quietly. Severloh's palms sweat on the MG grip. He thinks one last tactical thought: hold the arc, control the bursts, aim for choke points of the beach. He imagines each bullet's path as a line of defense in a geometric war. He imagines, absurdly, that geometry will win. At the edge of sleep, at the point where a man's mind invents futures to distract, Heinrich asks himself a small private question that will grow like a fungus. If they come in numbers his training has not seen, if the sea fills with ships and the sky with iron, will his letter be enough to hold his courage? Will the wall, for all its concrete, survive the arithmetic of an enemy who can bring more men, more guns, more shells, and more ships than the horizon had ever promised? The question lodges and will not be dislodged. It is the seed of a dread that will become the story of that day. When dawn finally comes, it will answer in a manner more absolute than any human voice, by the sight of a horizon, carpeted with a fleet, and the sound of guns that speak in tonnage. But dawn is still hours away. For now, Heinrich Severloh sits, polishes, prays in the language he knows. Steady hands, counted belts, and a stubborn belief in the wall they call destiny. Outside the bunker, somewhere between charts and the sea, decisions are being made that will measure men not by their courage, but by their nation's factories. Inside, a letter folds itself into the dark, and a man imagines a victory fought on instincts and skill. In the thin time before dawn, two incompatible truths walk towards each other, and the first clash will come not with words but with iron. What happens when conviction meets an industrial tide of men and material? The answer will begin with the sound of the first shell. 23:15, June 5, 1944. A radar screen in Normandy flickers, and then holds a shape, a slow, massive line moving out of the dark. To the men on the cliffs it is a number in a box. To the officers in Paris it is a report to be graded and filed. To Heinrich Severloh and his comrades the night is still small and familiar, a gun to clean, a letter to fold, a map to mark. They live by patterns. The war taught them to trust patterns. That trust is about to be tested in the smallest, most human ways. Two weather reports cross Europe like different versions of the same story. In Paris, Walter Stuber, the Luftwaffe meteorologist, reads pressures and gusts and writes impossible for landing. His authority is not arrogance. He works with the data at hand and with a conservative culture that values safety over gamble. His bulletin makes commanders breathe out. Patrols are cut back. Staff officers cash in days of leave. Rommel, who trusts his instincts about coastlines and timing, goes to Germany to see his wife on her birthday. He takes with him two small comforts, a cigarette case, and a new pair of grey suede shoes purchased in Paris. Those shoes are a human thing, a private, ordinary choice in a moment that will matter. It is easy to think of them now as a symbol of absent leadership. But in the bunker, the presence of a leader is not measured only in boots. It is measured in signals and orders. Far beyond the usual maps, Allied meteorological stations in Greenland and long-range flights find a narrow opening in the Atlantic. Group Captain James Stagg reads data from places the Wehrmacht's observers cannot see. He tells Eisenhower, "The window is short but real." The commander takes a decision that ripples down to the smallest man on the coast. The difference between those two forecasts is not a difference of weather only. It is a difference of reach. It is like trusting the local traffic report on your phone versus a satellite feed that shows a storm moving across the interstate. Most of us make life decisions every day based on the map we trust, whether to leave the house now or later, whether to take an umbrella, whether to board a plane. Soldiers make those same choices, but with death on the other side. The night moves from charts to radios. At 00:30, reports begin to arrive. Contradictory, scattered, impossible to sew into a single picture. Men report parachutes to the east, others report them to the west. Some say British troopers, others call them Americans. The new Allied arts of deception amplify the confusion. Dummy paratroopers, canvas bundles wired to pop their bags and whistle like real men, are dropped in Operation Titanic and Operation Rupert. They are theatre made of cheap materials. They clap and patter on the open fields like insects, and every crackle on the radio can become a battle in a man's mind. Here is a human picture you know in your life. Think of an alarm that goes off in your building late at night. People in the hallway shout different things. "Oh, fire!" It's a drill. Stay put. The first instinct is to move, to act, to make the tiny decisions that save you. In Normandy, the alarms were both real and false, and the orders from above often said, "Do nothing until you are told otherwise." Major Hans von Luck is a man in that corridor. Woken by reports of paratroopers, he rings command and asks permission to move his 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment. The reply is a single phrase that will echo in his memoirs, and through them, in history. Do not move until the situation clarifies. Von Luck later writes, "I knew at that moment we were lost." That sentence is less about fatalism and more about the corrosive force of hesitation. A person who wants to act and is told to wait learns a particular kind of helplessness. It is the same helplessness you feel when a surgeon delays an operation for bureaucratic reasons, or when a bus full of people sits stalled while an authority figures out a plan. Delay becomes a decision in itself. The mind hates it. Radar men and radio operators on the coast are trained to see noise and ignore it. They have seen Allied deception flights before, and they have been conditioned to treat large formations as routine provocations. Their experience becomes a filter that blocks reality. This is an essential human error. Experienced people interpret new data through the lens of past patterns. It is why you might ignore a text that later proves to be urgent, or why a manager can miss the first signs of a crisis because the inbox looks like last week's normal. The skill that keeps you from overreacting in daily life becomes paralysis in a storm. As dawn moves nearer, the German defensive world shows human cracks. Patrols have been cancelled in the Channel. The naval sweep that would have seen craft in daylight has been called off because of rough seas. Commanders meant to coordinate the defense are absent at war games or at home. Weapons are where doctrine placed them, pointing to the surf, belts stacked, mortars dug. But will and presence are missing. You can build physical walls the way you can secure your house with locks and alarms. You cannot build presence. Presence is a decision made of attention and timing. The men in the bunkers begin to feel a shift, like a draft under a door. Small anomalies become menacing. Reports of parachutists arriving in scattered pockets do not make sense. How can an enemy be in two places at once? How can you reconcile the map with the radio? The mind's need for story drives men to create answers. Some whisper that this is a feint, a trick to pull armor away. Others whisper that it is a prelude, a screen to mark landing flanks. The uncertainty is itself cruel. It turns sleep into a chemical of brittle memory. Men who have seen too much make jokes that are not funny. They tighten belts and avoid the eyes of their buddies to hide the brittle threads of fear. The psychological pressure is not only about fear, it is about identity. These men have been told that they represent an order, a nation, a cause. The idea that command can be absent is an affront to that identity. Think about how you feel when a team leader misses a meeting at work and the project unravels. That twinge of betrayed trust is small compared to what soldiers felt, but it is the same nerve. The officer who keeps his men ready but is forced to watch for a decision he cannot control becomes a man split in two, between duty and impotence. At dawn, a new variable shows itself. Radar men who for hours have seen shapes suddenly see not blips but a hole. The horizon begins to darken with ships, but many German observers are not yet ready to translate the sight into action. History will call it the greatest naval armada ever assembled. 6,939 vessels, 1,213 warships, 4,126 landing craft. The numbers act on the imagination like a stamp closing a book. For the men on the cliffs, those numbers are abstract until they become a line of hulls on the water, a grey wave moving toward the beaches. The comprehension of scale is a slow, painful thing. It arrives in stages. First the sight, then the voice on the radio, then the orders that do not come. One soldier later wrote that he felt as if the whole world had turned up at his doorstep. That is not an exaggeration. For men who had been told that the enemy was weak and divided, the view of thousands of ships arriving like a new tide was a psychological earthquake. Propaganda had taught them an enemy of brittle will. Reality showed them an alliance that could synchronize weather, intelligence, deception, and steel. The soldiers now faced not only bullets, but the erosion of an entire worldview. Pause for a moment and imagine this in your life. A company you believed in announces a merger overnight. The messages are contradictory. Your boss is unreachable, and the office that felt steady now feels like a theater of whispers. You check your phone for news, but the signal is crossed. Life repeats the same pattern. Trust rests on coordination. Coordination rests on clear information. When information breaks, the fragile edifice trembles. For the men in Normandy, the stakes are far higher, but the pattern is familiar. There are tiny acts of courage and decisive confusion. Radar operators, exhausted, try to reconcile movements. Young NCOs take radios and run to forward posts. Officers who accept the delay still plan contingencies in the small hours. These gestures are human and necessary, but they cannot make up for a strategic absence. The mind of a soldier becomes a ledger of imagined futures. He writes in it the times orders may come, the likely intervals at which the enemy will knock, the amount of ammo to ration. Every little calculation is a last attempt to convert uncertainty into habit. What makes paralysis contagious is its psychological logic. If you hesitate and survive, you are reinforced that hesitation saved you. If you act and are punished, your caution is rewarded. The German command structure, stressed and overloaded, favors restraint over risk. It is the conservative reflex that in peacetime is sensible and in crisis can be deadly. Von Luck's cry to move becomes a moral signal. The right decision is felt only by those who can bear the guilt of being wrong. Waiting is easier until waiting becomes death. By the time the horizon begins to glow with the first hints of iron, the men have been strengthened in some ways and broken in others. They are mechanically ready. They have rituals, bullets, and maps. They are not mentally ready for a flood of choices they did not plan for. The greatest danger is not the sea or the ships. It is the time in which information arrives slowly, and decisions are made slower. It is why we, in our daily lives, fear not the catastrophe, but the delay of help, the ambulance that takes too long, the tech support that leaves us on hold. In war, that delay is a sentence. The morning that will etch itself into memory is hours away. The hour of decision has passed into the hands of men and machines far removed from the bunkers. A meteorologist's chart, a radar line, a staff officer's note, small things will combine into the largest of human stories. The men in WN62 cannot know the charts. They can only feel the absence and the small tremors in the earth that say something huge is moving. They listen for orders that do not come. They find themselves making choices in the spaces left by command. The moral of this prelude is cruel and simple. When institutions fail to translate data into action, individuals must live with the consequences. If you have felt the unease of waiting for a decision that affects your life, a medical test, a job offer, a call from someone far away, you have touched the grain of what these men felt. The scale is different, but the human math is the same. Decisions delayed are deaths delayed. Orders withheld are lives wagered. The final break will come when sight and sound converge, when the channel ceases to be a line on a map and becomes a highway of iron and noise. When that first ship scratches the horizon, every man will know that the night of uncertainty is over, and the work of survival begins. If this exploration of the losing side sphere and the cost of hesitation matters to you, if you want to follow the human thread from the bunker slit to the tide, and watch how decisions cascade into history, please click the red button in the corner of the screen to subscribe. Join a community that seeks the untold angles of history, the faces behind the numbers, and the lessons that matter today. Subscribing keeps these stories alive. It helps us bring more measured human accounts to the light. Click the red button now. Stay with us and see what happens when the horizon finally answers. When dawn arrives, the horizon will stop being a theory. It will be a movement of hulls, and the men who trusted patterns will have to relearn how to count in a new currency. Sheer numbers and relentless supply. What will they do when numbers drown doctrine? The next hours will tell. Dawn strips the night like a curtain and reveals a horizon the defenders have never been taught to measure, not by contour or color, but by count. Hulls gather until the sea looks like a carpet of iron. The number is staggering. 939 vessels, warships, transports, landing craft, poured into a channel that had been a line on their maps and became, within hours, a highway. For men trained to measure threat in units and divisions, this sight is not just surprising. It is a new scale of reality that their minds struggle to hold. The Armada's presence is immediate in the body. The vibration through the cliffs when steam turbines spool, the low rolling sound of propellers like distant thunder. It translates into a physical certainty no radar blip could convey. Observers who had grown used to reading enemy movements as tactical puzzles now confront something more like a flood. Bernhard Fröcking's words, "The whole world arriving on our doorstep," are not exaggeration, but attempt at translation. How do you put the weight of a global industrial effort into a sentence? The men on the cliffs feel the translation as a pressure on their chest. Artillery from the sea begins as a new kind of weather. The first salvos change the landscape. Battleship guns are not simply weapons, they are tidal forces. USS Texas with her 14-inch guns pounds at Point du Hoc. HMS Warspite brings 15-inch rounds that thunder like falling buildings. A single 12 or 15-inch shell weighs hundreds of pounds and carries a shock that shivers concrete. Bunker walls designed to survive bombing crack like plaster. Men are torn from their positions, not always by fragments but by the concussive dignity of enormous mass hitting earth. Whole rooms collapse, burying men alive. The defenders learn a terrible lesson. Their fixed points of confidence can be unmade in minutes by tonnage and trajectory. This bombardment is methodical. It is not random rage but arithmetic. Target, weigh, fire, repeat. The Allied naval plan is to methodically neutralize coastal defenses so that landing craft can reach the shore. For soldiers inside the concrete, the noise is not only physical destruction, it is a demoralizing proof that their walls are negotiable. The Atlantic wall turns, for a terrifying morning, into a set of ruins that a single wave of shells can rearrange at will. What is the mind's measure of helplessness when stone yields to tonnage? The Luftwaffe's capacity to answer is crushed not by inability alone, but by attrition and timing. The morning brings not a storm of German fighters, but a near absence. Oberst Josef Pips Priller and one wingman manage a single strafing run against Sword Beach. They make a brief brave sweep in FW-190s and are driven off by Allied fighter cover. That solitary sortie stands as both act of courage and symbol of systemic impotence. Germany's air force is present in spirit, but absent in numbers. On a day when the sky should have been a protective dome, it is instead a corridor clogged with Allied control. Imagine expecting an umbrella and seeing a single torn canopy. The expectation of an air umbrella had been part of the defenders' psychological shelter. Losing it is like learning that your most trusted friend will not answer when you call. Men who looked up for cover now look up to see machines they scarcely recognize, either too few or too late. In 1,000 small ways that morning teaches a new vocabulary. Not just "we are under fire," but "we are exposed." The naval guns begin to silence some emplacements, but also reveal another truth. Sheer bombardment cannot kill resolve if the defenders are dispersed and well prepared. Many bunkers survive as shells arc and fall. Crews are buried and dug out only to man guns again between salvos. The human will to fight, stubborn, ritualized, and often fatal, converts the remaining concrete into a stage for last stands. The sea's tonnage breaks some positions and births new micro-conflicts, men trapped by collapsed ceilings, gunners who refuse to abandon their posts, crews trying to salvage rounds from wrecked stores. Why does courage persist even when survival seems numerically impossible? The psychological shock is layered. There is immediate terror at the physical force. There is the erosion of doctrine, the realization that what they had called impenetrable can be undone. Then there is the deeper collapse, the cognitive mismatch called material shock. Men had learned that fire and loss reduce an enemy's numbers and therefore their threat. On D-Day they watch again and again as destroyed boats are replaced by others, as bodies fall and beaches are reoccupied. Their habitual equation, losses equal attrition, fails. The brain cannot easily rewire a lifetime of tactical logic. Confusion becomes a secondary wound, one that corrodes decision-making and amplifies fear. Allied deception complicates perception further. Dummy paratroops bang their cheap cloth against fields, radio chatter made to confuse, small fires to simulate arrivals. These tricks multiply uncertainty until action becomes a risky guess. For a commander like Hans von Luck, who wanted to move his panzers, the sight of seemingly scattered parachute landings on both flanks becomes a dilemma: strike and risk falling into an ambush, or wait and allow the enemy to consolidate. The paralysis is not always cowardice. It is a rational fear of playing into an enemy's plan. Even technical details add to mental burden. The MG-42 barrels heat under prolonged fire. Their life depends on controlled bursts. Ammunition is a counting game, belts laid out like accounts. The defenders have stockpiles calculated for certain battle rhythms, not for hundreds of landing craft arriving simultaneously. Each shell fired is a deduction from a ledger that was never intended for a campaign of replacement. The idea that numbers could outpace resolve is abstract until you find yourself rewiring your trigger hand to ration rounds. Is the will to fight a matter of moral choice or mathematical possibility? The naval barrage is not merely physical punishment, it also functions as psychological shaping. It creates corridors where attackers can move with less resistance and forces defenders into mental patterns governed by constraint. The noise of heavy guns becomes a metronome, and the intervals between salvos the measure of life inside. Men learn to count in seconds between booms, to breathe in rhythm with the tide of explosions. Those rhythms morph into a kind of learned helplessness for some and a savage concentration for others. As ships lower their davits and landing craft form into waves, the Germans on the cliffs see not merely boats but logistics made visible. Each landing craft is more than a vessel. It is the embodiment of an industrial promise: tanks, rifles, men, fuel. Behind each hull is a factory line that will keep sending replacements. The defenders had trained for battles where victory could be achieved by tactical superiority or cleverness. Here they are confronted by an enemy who has turned production into firepower. The comparison is brutal. One side fights with courage and engineering limited by resources. The other fights with courage multiplied by assembly lines that never sleep. What do you defend against when your enemy can simply make more of everything? Within the bunkers, men try to keep meaning by telling stories, by repeating slogans, by performing rituals of discipline. They rub a thumb over a seam of cloth. They check the sling of an MG. They rehearse arc of fire. These small human acts are vital. They are not strategies, but lifelines. Yet each act is also a confession. You are mortally aware of what you cannot control. The day's naval and aerial violence reshapes not only the coast, but the inner geography of the defenders' minds. Confidence fractures into pragmatic terror and stubborn ritual. The Atlantic Wall, for all its concrete, is revealed as a set of assumptions about time, supply, and command that collapse under a new arithmetic. As the first troops approach the beach, a final form of shock will wake. The practical, grinding sense that the battle is not only about who fires truer, but about which nation can feed its guns with more metal and minds with less doubt. The sand on Omaha did not know which way to die. Men came down the ramps into a world rewritten by weight, steel hulls, foaming wakes, and a sound so constant it seemed to be another weather. At 06:35, Heinrich Severloh opened fire. His MG-42, fed with belts and fury, spat short, controlled bursts at the first lines of Americans. The gun's cyclic rate could reach 200 rounds per minute. In practiced hands, it became a razor of rhythm. He later wrote that he fired 13,500 rounds that day. The barrel warped from heat, his palms blistered. The bunker filled with spent casings like the pages of a ledger that could not tell him how much a life was worth. He wept alone because numbers began to mean less than the exact sound of a boy falling. The immediate picture is visceral. Men flattened in the sand, landing craft burning, smoke blurring the line where sea meets sky. The naval guns had opened at first light. Battleships and cruisers pounded the coast with shells, whose mass broke things that once seemed permanent. The USS Texas fired 255 14-inch shells at Point du Hoc in 34 minutes. HMS Warspite's 15-inch guns made the land feel small and brittle. Concrete casemates cracked under the bombardment. Rooms collapsed, burying men alive. The defenders who had trusted Stone discovered that Stone had a price and that price could be paid in minutes. What terror that does not end quickly does to a human mind is subtle and corrosive. The Germans were trained to expect attrition. Bodies and boats would be lost and the enemy would thin. What they could not digest was the arithmetic of replacement. For every crippled landing craft, others came. For every fallen man, more men stepped forward from crafts that never seemed to end. This was material shock. It is not only the fear of bullets, but the cognitive collapse when your basic equation about how battle works no longer holds. You fire, and the beach refills. You shoot, and the sea keeps offering more. This lesson was brutal, small, and precise. Ammunition runs dry faster than hope. Wehrmacht supply records show positions meant to hold for 3 days exhausted their stocks in hours. Artillery batteries, calculated to produce a controlled weight of fire, watched their shells lessen and their tempos slow. A calculation made in an office far from the dune, how much to assign, how long to expect, dissolved into chaos on the ground. Men in bunkers began to count, not in bullets fired, but in rounds left. Each belt removed from a crate felt like calling a friend to say goodbye. Amid that arithmetic came a more desperate kind of learning: improvisation. Some crews dug back into shattered magazines for rounds, half buried in mud. Others tied belts together with trembling hands. Severloh burned a groove into the barrel as the weapon kinked under prolonged use. He could feel metal changing shape like a memory fraying. His mind, that had trusted drills and doctrine, now worried about the practical. How many belts remain? Where is the next crate? Who will carry it across a beach full of shrapnel? Behind all of this was another landscape that the defenders saw as hopelessly foreign: Allied logistics. What the Germans saw as waves were the visible end of a process that began months earlier in factories and harbors. Within days of D-Day, the Allies were landing 15,000 tons of supplies daily. LSATs discharged armor and trucks in hours. Artificial harbors, the Mulberry ports, were being assembled like mechanical promises to keep the invasion alive. The defenders, drilled to count bullets and men, could not easily count what an industrial machine could pour ashore day after day. How do you stop a tide, whose source is 1,000 miles inland in factories that never close? The shock of that scale fed the psychology of defeat as the day wore on. Men who had been taught to measure success by a county's courage now measured it by production rates they could not imagine. Ford's Willow Run plant, a detail that later became a symbol, produced one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes at its peak. In factories, not in troops, war was being made. For a soldier in a bunker, this was a hard fact. If the enemy could replace every man you shot with a dozen more within a week, what value did a single life buy? Outside the beaches, armored response faltered on the axis of time. Major Hans von Luck had been kept waiting. When the 21st Panzer Division finally moved, it did so late in the afternoon. They reached between Lyon-sur-Mer and Luc-sur-Mer toward evening, the only German armored formation to reach the coast on D-Day. They found a scene of fragments, noises, and not the cohesive enemy mass they had been told to fear. When Operation Mallard's 250 gliders landed reinforcements for the British 6th Airborne at 21 Bayonne, the panzers hesitated and then withdrew. They lost 54 tanks and armored vehicles that day, about 25% of their strength. A counterattack that might have mattered had been delayed until momentum had turned against it. Delay became death counted in cylinders and tracks. The reason for that delay, traveled on air and wire. Allied air superiority meant every road, every railhead, and every convoy was vulnerable. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, stationed near Toulouse, took 17 days to reach Normandy. A trip that should have taken 3 days in peaceful conditions cost them 17 because Allied air power and interdiction had turned the approach into a gauntlet. They lost roughly 30% of vehicles to air attack. For the German soldier, who counted prowess and bravery as primary resources, this was a new metric of impotence. You could fight well and still be undone by the inability to move. On the beaches, the Allies showed innovations that felt like tricks of a different logic. Hobart's funnies, modified Churchill tanks with flails, bridging gear, flamethrowers, and amphibious adaptations, solved problems the defenders thought fixed. A minefield that had once been a death sentence could be flailed open. A beach obstacle could be bypassed. To men whose entire doctrine had been shaped by a certain kind of armored logic, these altered machines seemed like answers from a future war. They changed terrain and therefore changed what tactics meant. How does a soldier regroup his mental map when the enemy seems to have invented solutions to all his best plans overnight? And then there were the airborne operations. The 6th Airborne, the US 82nd and 101st. These formations did not act like earlier parachute units the Wehrmacht had seen. They dropped divisions' worth of men into the rear, used gliders to bring heavier equipment, and kept supply lines open. Oberst Friedrich von der Heiter, a veteran, later said plainly, "Our paratroops were small, theirs were large and supplied." The psychological effect was enormous. When soldiers see enemies behind them and ahead, the decision becomes not simply where to fire, but whether to fire and risk hitting their own. Units refused to move because every path might be a trap. Men fired at shadows and sometimes at their own. When the 21st Panzer did finally move on the night of June 6th, von Luck's column was illuminated by parachute flares and shredded by destroyer gunfire. "It was like daylight," he wrote. "Destroyers could pick out vehicles as easily as a hunter picks a rabbit. The Panzers lost half their strength without seeing a single Allied soldier. The air and naval coordination turned night into day for the attackers and made concealment impossible." In that moment, artifice of control failed. The battlefield was rewritten by sensors and flares and the simple principle that everything in motion was exposed. The German command's reaction turned into a portrait of fragmentation. Radio networks failed under Allied jamming. Telephone cables were cut by resistance and air action. Whole divisions disappeared from headquarters maps. General Lieutenant Max Pemsel watched his contacts evaporate. Men tried to act locally, making decisions without a larger picture. The entire organizational structure became a patchwork of isolated choices. Some commanders acted boldly and were destroyed. Some did nothing and watched men die. Each choice was a small moral calculus with lethal outcomes. The Allied logistical edge only widened. Mulberry harbors and LSTs made lodgement permanent and scalable. Within days, amphibious landing craft and convoys became established supply highways. The invaders did not arrive as a thin spear, but as a network. Beaches, ports, roads, depots. Within a week, the Allies had a flow of men and material that the German garrison could not match. Replacement was a weapon. Tanks could be lost in the dozens and replaced in weeks. Men could be rotated and resupplied on a scale that mocked the defenders' math. That scale produced a moral exhaustion as much as a physical one. By June 12th, the Germans had lost some 26,000 men, killed, wounded, or missing, roughly the strength of 2 divisions. The elite paratroopers, the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, who had been taught never to retreat, reported that they no longer exist as a combat unit. Their commander told headquarters that survivors were psychologically broken. The image is stark. Trained, elite soldiers undone not only by combat, but by the sense that all previous rules had changed. Even moments of tactical brilliance could not alter strategic imbalance. Michael Wittmann's action at Villers-Bocage, where he destroyed more than a dozen tanks and carriers, became a propaganda jewel. Yet his victory was a brief flare in a night of numbers. The Allies replaced their losses within hours. Wittmann himself would later be killed in August. The loss of one highly skilled tank ace could not shift a tide of production and supply that dwarfed individual genius. The campaign moved from a set of landings into a grinding attrition of space. Cherbourg, a fortified port that should have held for weeks, fell in 5 days. The garrison, expected to resist to the last bullet, surrendered on June 26. General Lieutenant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben explained later that resistance became meaningless against unlimited enemy resources. The moral tone is a simple ledger. When the enemy can resupply in volumes you cannot match, endurance becomes a hollow virtue. The turning points kept being structural and industrial. Operation Cobra late in July proved devastating. Over 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers concentrated over a narrow corridor, dropping more than 4,100 tons of bombs. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein reported that his division was annihilated. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, watching from what was thought safe, was killed. The power to compress destruction into a focused area had become a new strategic instrument. If an army could be ground to dust by tonnage concentrated by wings, then courage alone became an unaffordable virtue. Then came the Falaise Pocket, where the German retreat collapsed into catastrophe. Approximately 10,000 German soldiers died in the pocket, roughly 50,000 were taken prisoner. Over 300 tanks and armored vehicles were lost, along with thousands of other vehicles. Men described roads thick with burning vehicles and horses, a landscape of apocalyptic collapse. For many survivors, the choice was surrender rather than an endless visible death under bombs and strafing. The psychological cost, the sense that fate had been removed from human hands and handed to production and coordination, is as deep as any wound. By the end of August, the accounting was stark. From June 6 to August 31, German losses in Normandy numbered about 320,000 casualties, some 30,000 killed, 80,000 wounded, and roughly 210,000 missing or captured. They lost roughly 2,300 tanks and virtually all their armor in France. They lost more than 2,000 aircraft. Allied losses were not negligible, roughly 209,672 casualties, but they had the capacity to replace them. They lost about 4,000 tanks and more than 4,100 aircraft, but their industrial output and logistics turned loss into a manageable number. For the German soldier, the arithmetic was final. The enemy could absorb losses and continue. Germany could not. What the defenders had learned, painfully and personally, was that modern war is as much about factories as it is about courage. Men like Heinrich Severloh returned to civilian life haunted not only by the noise, but by an inner calculation. Bravery could not stop production. They saw the Allies' capacity to keep sending men, guns, and fuel as a kind of moral erasure. For soldiers who had believed in destiny written by doctrine and heroism, the realization that victory could be quantified by conveyor belts was a violent redefinition of meaning. The D-Day beachheads transformed into a living laboratory where the principles of industrial warfare were written in mud and blood. For every bunker that fell with a last defiant volley, dozens of others were overwhelmed not by a better soldier, but by a better supply line. The personal acts of courage remained vivid and terrible, yet they were dwarfed by arithmetic. Men could burn and fight and die with honor. The enemy could replace them. What does honor mean against a ledger? And still the question lives. When numbers replace meaning, when factories make the decisive weapons, how do the men left to fight recover a sense of purpose? The answer is not only in history, but in the faces of the survivors who carried the knowledge forward, that in modern war, the quality of a man's will can be rendered inadequate by the scale of what the enemy can build. Their loss was technical and moral at once. What they gave up was not only ground, but the certainty that valor alone could make history. They came to Normandy believing in certainty, in doctrine, in orders, in the idea that courage and careful planning could make history bend. They left with a different, quieter education, a lesson written not in proclamations, but in the slow arithmetic of replacement, in ruined bunkers, and in the faces of the men who watched their certainties die. For Heinrich Severloh, for Friedrich von der Heydter, for Hans von Luck and thousands like them, D-Day and the campaign that followed were not just military defeat. They were a moral and psychological unraveling that lasted far longer than the shooting. Think of a life arranged around a simple promise: work, fight, return. For many German soldiers that promise broke on the beaches. Severloh, who cleaned his MG42 and folded the letter from Metzingen against his heart, survived the day but not the memory. He told later how he counted shells as if they were bones, how he cried in the bunker when the gun's barrel warped, and the sand around Omaha, filled with men who would not be replaced by the factories he now understood, lay on the other side of the world. Von der Heiter's regiment, elite and proud, reported that it no longer exists as a combat unit. That phrase is not bureaucratic. It is the collapse of identity itself. The technical facts make the moral point sharper. From June 6 to August 31st, German forces in Normandy suffered roughly 320,000 casualties, near 30,000 killed, 80,000 wounded, and about 210,000 missing or captured. They lost approximately 2,300 tanks and more than 2,100 aircraft. The Allies, for all their losses, could replace men and material at rates Germany did not have the capacity to meet. The Allies landed nearly 7,000 vessels on D-Day alone, and within days were discharging 15,000 tons of supplies a day. Willow Run's assembly lines produced bombers faster than the Wehrmacht could sink them. Factories and ports made logistics into a weapon. The numbers are blunt instruments, but behind each digit is a life, a family, a soldier, whose private ledger of hope was closed. What makes this history so painful is not only the defeat, but the collapse of a worldview. For years, German propaganda taught troops to see war as destiny, a contest of will and racial vigor. In Normandy, those narratives failed the men who trusted them. They met an enemy whose strength did not rest solely on a handful of brilliant commanders or a mythology of superiority, but on an industrial base and coalition discipline that converted factories into front lines. The result was not simply battlefield loss, it was an existential unmasking. Men who had been told they were part of a chosen cause discovered they were pawns in a conflict governed by production schedules and shipping manifests. The psychological consequences were immediate and lasting. Material shock, the inability of a mind trained in older logics of attrition to absorb a new arithmetic where losses were instantly replaced, affected thousands. Soldiers who had been steady in defeat on other fronts found themselves disoriented, unable to reconcile experience with the new truth. When an opponent can pour more men and machines ashore every day, valor alone is not enough. The Wehrmacht's finest officers, people such as General der Panzertruppen Heinrich Severloh and General Hans Speidel, wrote after the fact, the enemy's material superiority was decisive. They were not seeking excuses, they were diagnosing reality. Yet diagnosis does not soften the human cost. Cherbourg, a fortress meant to deny the Allies a major port, fell in 6 days. The Falaise Gap turned retreat into starvation. Tens of thousands of Germans were killed or captured in a chaotic burning landscape of convoys and corpses. Men recounted roads thick with defeated horses, with columns of burning trucks and tanks. For many, surrender was not capitulation of spirit, but a choice between certain destruction and survival. The scale of Allied air and artillery power made roads lethal and movement impossible. Units that might have influenced the battle simply never arrived in time, not because commanders were weak, but because their vehicles and men were shattered by interdiction. There are individual flashes that complicate the narrative of loss. Michael Wittmann's action at Villers-Bocage showed skill and audacity, yet his triumph was short-lived and could not change the strategic balance. Such episodes highlight a terrible truth. Individual excellence can be heroic and yet irrelevant in the face of overwhelming industrial capacity. That is the bitterest irony for soldiers raised on stories of singular heroism. What then should we feel when we look back from the other side of history? Should we pity the defeated, only to forget their responsibility? Should we see them only as victims of circumstance, or as agents who helped to sustain an ideology that killed millions? Reflection must hold both tensions. We can and should condemn the political crimes of the regime that sent these men to war, while also recognizing the private human costs of defeat. The German soldiers' experience in Normandy shows that men suffer under any banner. Ideology can be both cause and casualty. There is a lesson of humility and responsibility here for all who look at the past. Modern warfare is not decided only by courage or cleverness. It is decided by systems, factories, logistics, data, and the ability to sustain a campaign over months and years. That pragmatic reality does not absolve moral choices, but it does reshape our understanding of how wars are won and why nations suffer. Industrial capacity became the decisive instrument of victory. That fact transformed the moral landscape of the 20th century and continues to shape geopolitics today. We owe attention to the survivors who lived with these contradictions. Many returned to shattered towns and broken families, carrying guilt and a new understanding of what had been lost. Some became teachers, professors, or simply quiet citizens who rarely spoke of the sand and the guns. Severloh and others lived long enough to meet former enemies across tables and to realize in the most painful and human way that both sides had been young men caught in something larger than themselves. Their stories demand that we listen, not to glorify, but to understand. History is not a ledger without faces. Each statistic is a life whose end or survival shaped families and communities. If we allow the story of Normandy to be only about strategy and production, we miss the real lesson, that human beings, inexorably, bear the consequences of industrial decisions made far from the front. Factories and ports may decide outcomes, but the cost is paid in flesh, memory, and the quiet, lifelong reckonings of those who survive. If this account moved you, if it shifted the way you think about courage, responsibility, and the meaning of defeat, please stay and help keep these voices alive. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue to tell history from the human edge, the stories of those who lost, who survived, and who teach us about the cost of modern war. Like the video if you found it meaningful, and leave a comment, a question, a thought, or a personal memory. You can share anonymously if you prefer. Your engagement helps us preserve complex histories and learn from them together. Thank you for listening.